Alright, so hey everyone, my name is Dan. Over the last year I've been doing research on regional dialects in Japan, and I wanted to kind of present about that today, but since this is JALT, I figured I'd see what I could do to tie that back into education, because that's where I've spent most of my career in northern Japan, teaching very young learners. And I just wanted to share with you some of the thoughts that I had as I was working on regional dialects and how I think I want to use this in language teaching. And I'm going to do that by talking about the concept of identity, which some of you may or may not be familiar with. But what I'll do first is I'll describe what the idea of identity is, how it relates to education and success and failure in language learning. I'm going to tell you about Japanese dialects, and contrary to what people might expect from the word dialects, I'm going to be talking about L1 dialects, not English dialects. And then tell you finally how I think we can use this information to improve our classroom atmospheres. So, what is identity? Well, there's at least two different kinds of identity. Identity refers to, group identity refers to the way in which we form associations with groups and engage in conflicts with other groups. There's a great experiment by Dan Ariely in his book where he talks about getting a bunch of university students to take a test. And he wanted to check how much students would cheat on the test. He made it a little bit easy for them to cheat. Ran this experiment a few times and got a baseline for how much students cheat on average. Then he introduced another variable. He put in an acting student into the group who was cheating in a very obvious manner. And he asked the question, how would this affect rates of cheating across the board? Turns out it depended on the sweater that the acting student was wearing. If the acting student was wearing a sweater from the same university as all the other students, rates of cheating went up. Thinking there is that, everyone sees this one guy cheating, he gets away with it, why not? We can all do it, it's alright to cheat a little bit more. Whereas if this cheating student was wearing a sweater from a rival university, rates of cheating went down. And thinking there is that all the other students see this guy cheating, and they think, well, maybe that's how they do things over there, but we have higher ethical standards. We're not like those guys at that rival university. And so rates of cheating went down. And that experiment, I think, is a great example of how your group associations can impact your behavior. I'm sure you can think of lots of other examples where your group associations are important. Sports is a nice one. I'm Canadian, so if you show this image to fans of two different hockey teams, fans of one team will tell you that it's a perfectly clean, legal hockey hit. Fans of the other team will tell you that it's a dirty hit and the guy should be suspended, maybe at least penalized or something, right? So which group you associate with can actually impact how you interpret things that come into your perception. There's also the idea of personal identity, and this refers more to the way that you negotiate your behavior and who you are with the world around you. Here are some of the elements that go into making up your personal identity. And in particular, I want to draw your attention to the role that language plays in this. Writers like Whedon and Norton talk a lot about the connection between language and identity. Norton actually goes and calls language and identity mutually constitutive, saying that how you talk impacts who you are, and who you are impacts how you speak. And you can kind of see this. The logic here is basically that language is one of the ways in which you express a lot of these traits to the world around you. You can tell a lot about the kind of person someone is by the way they speak. In addition, we can also control the way we speak to present a different image of ourselves to the world around us. So if we want to change our identity, we can also change how we speak. And we do that on a regular basis. You speak differently to your family than you do to maybe your more distant friends and then you would in a professional situation. So your language is an important part of your personal identity. So that's, in a nutshell, what an identity is. Why does it matter in education? Well, identity is connected usually to learning outcomes based on the idea that how a student's identity relates to the subject matter being taught is going to impact largely their motivation toward the subject and their interest in actually getting something out of the course, or their interest in, let's say, doing the homework. So let me give you a few examples. This is Patricia Genang. She was studying Chinese as part of her PhD course. When she started her course, she was already multilingual. She spoke various European languages. She was a colonel in the US Army, so quite an accomplished woman. But as she went through the course, she grew increasingly unhappy with it. And although she did end up finishing the course, she just did not get nearly as much out of it as she thought she might have. What happened? Well, here's an analysis by Duff saying that the classroom greeting and leave-taking routines were juvenile and demeaning, socializing her into an infantile identity she did not want. So the way the class was being run treated her as an individual in a way that was conflicting with her personal identity. She did not feel happy, or she did not feel that she was being treated in a way that was appropriate for the kind of person that she was, and so she ended up not liking the class and not putting as much work into it as she maybe could have. Another example, Mai. She was learning English. She was from Vietnam. She wanted to learn English to basically get a better job at her factory. She knew that she would have to talk with clients, maybe exchange emails, but the class that she was going to was mainly centered around oral presentations by the students, who were told to tell people about their ethnic backgrounds, the countries that they came from. And what happened here? She ended up not liking the course, dropping out, not succeeding here. An analysis by Norton says that when her English class focused on the past lives of students across diverse geographic communities, Mai struggled to make a connection between the language practices of the classroom and her imagined identity. So who she saw herself being as an English speaker was at odds with the image of an English speaker that her classroom was promoting. So she ended up dropping out there. Oops. Another example, this is Yu. He was one of my students. He was an elementary school student, so he took lessons once a week with his class in school. He was also taking private lessons, so he studied with me privately once a week. In private lessons, Yu was an excellent student. He had his things memorized every week. He could tell me about his day. You know, I'd ask him, hey, what did you do today? I play soccer with my friends, I write in my book, I study math, things like that. He was getting pretty good. He could pronounce his L's and R's really well, right? But get him in class and he would not speak a word. So what's going on there? Actually, you told me what he felt when he was in class. One of the reasons he did not want to speak English in class was that he was one of the boys, right? One of the boys in this class. And the boys in this class were typically not very strong academically. So to show everyone that he could actually speak some English and he could actually excel in this class may have ostracized him from the group, may have damaged his group identity, and so that was quite scary to him. In addition, Yu's teacher was something of a proud woman who did not like to be shown up by her students, or anyone else for that matter. And Yu was quite aware that his own English pronunciation was at times better than his teacher's. So what happens? If he speaks in class, he runs the risk of being told to pronounce something a different way, or he stands the risk of being told something by the teacher, to which he either has to, if he feels that that is incorrect, he either has to kind of suck it up and just do things incorrectly, or he has to confront the teacher and basically get into try to tell her that he's doing things correctly. Because he's the inferior, as an individual, he is the inferior in this power relationship, he was not very keen to speak up in class or to participate in classroom activities. So those are examples of where both Yu's group and individual identity were kind of shaping his classroom experience in a quite negative fashion. This is probably nothing new. There's a few different frameworks that work with the idea of identity and examine success and failure in language learning through the lens of identity. Here are a few of the bigger ones. And as you can see, there's a good amount of study done on each one of these. But they're all different ways of explaining or talking about how a student's identity relates to what they're learning. So I said I was going to talk about dialects, and I said I was going to talk about Japanese dialects, which is what I've been studying for the past year. Let me switch over to that. Some of you may know there are a lot of Japanese dialects. Some of them are famously mutually unintelligible. This is a map of one particular phonetic variation. There's tons more. And around the turn of the last century, the government wanted to unify the country a bit more, and so in order to do this, one of the things that they did was to standardize the language. And they created this thing, which I'm oversimplifying here, but they created this thing called Standard Japanese, and basically said, okay, the education system now has to use this, and everyone has to learn how to speak Standard Japanese. So starting in 1904, all educational materials by law had to be produced in Standard Japanese, and in classrooms in all schools across the country, children were actively taught to speak Standard Japanese, actively taught that their regional dialects were incorrect, were vulgar, dirty. Sometimes they were corporally punished for speaking these dialects. Even as late as the 1970s, educational guidelines across the country explicitly required that students be taught how to speak standard Japanese. So what happens? Over several generations, when every single person who goes through the education system is taught that you have to speak this a certain way, as a society, you start to associate that form of speaking with education and all the societal and economic benefits that education brings you. So standard Japanese became the language of economic and societal success and educational success in Japan. Other dialects, specifically rural dialects, well, they're improperly pronounced and should be cleansed. The local music from these regions should be cleansed of the dialect if it's going to be suitable for public consumption. Even in modern times, if you see dialects being used in TV or in movies or in commercials, very often it's something to be made fun of. And even if you go down and ask people who speak a certain dialect, what do you think of the way you speak, they will tell you that it's incorrect. They start to believe that the way they speak Japanese is incorrect Japanese, is somehow flawed. So put yourself in the position of, for example, a child learning English in the Tohoku region, where the language that you speak at home, the dialect that you speak with your friends, with your family, that comes most naturally to you, is perceived to be extremely unintelligent. Everybody has this attitude, and I reiterate, this is not just people, let's say, from Tokyo telling you that your dialect sounds unintelligent. If you ask people in Tohoku themselves, what do you think about your own dialect, these are the answers they give you. It's inarticulate, it's unrefined, it's unintelligent. Right? It's not modern, it's not urban. These are the lowest scoring words associated with these rural dialects. So again, you put yourself in the position of a child entering the education system, where this is not said to you explicitly, but this is something that is kind of felt throughout society, that the way you speak is not articulate, is not intelligent. You're going to start to believe, at a certain level, that people who speak like you are not meant to be educated. So what I'm suggesting is that negative dialect attitudes are going to negatively influence our students' self-images, which is going to lead to lower motivations and expectations for themselves as to what they get out of the education system, and ultimately to lower rates of success. This is more or less kind of general dialect attitudes theory. But I'm going to suggest that it's even worse than that when we get to foreign language education. Because what happens when we actually start teaching a student a foreign language? At some point, almost every single beginner book, almost every single teacher who has taught low-level English has probably done something like this, right? You associate words or concepts in your target language with something that the students already understand. And what probably very often escapes most of us is that our students may not speak like this at all. Certainly for a lot of my lower performing students when I was in Tohoku, they would not express a sentiment like this with the Japanese, watashi wa tomodachi to issō ni taberu. They would probably say something more akin to, and forgive me for my disastrous pronunciation here, but if they were to express this sentiment, they would say something like, wa ake yaku to issō ni meshigu, or something like that, right? It sounds completely different. So we're associating this target language, this foreign language, to something that's not exactly their primary mode of communication. It's a little bit, they can understand it, but it's a little bit further removed from what they would normally be inclined to express. And if we're doing that at the lexical level, I think it's going to make it already much more difficult, let's say when we're getting to plurality or subject-verb agreement. If we're already doing this at the lexical level, trying to get them to see the importance of learning these more complicated matters is going to be quite difficult. So I'm going to add that to my little diagram here and say that if we're translating our foreign language into a distant dialect, it's going to create a more distant attitude toward that foreign language in our learners. So what? Well, I think most people here most likely don't use a lot of Japanese when they teach English, and I'm actually a proponent of that. I don't think we should, but it is a reality that Japanese is spoken in this country. And it is a reality that teachers interact with their students in Japanese, whether that be English teachers, foreign English teachers, or just native Japanese teachers who teach English. And this may not necessarily, you may not speak with them, even when you speak with your students outside of the classroom, you may find yourself using some Japanese, especially at the lower levels. So, fortunately, a lot of Japanese teachers have already kind of clued into this. Ever since the outright ban on rural dialects has been kind of lifted from the education system, Japanese teachers have started to bring in these dialects back into the classroom, and they're finding that it helps make the classroom management easier, helps get students more engaged in the classroom, in the learning process, and it does seem that a lot of Japanese teachers are starting to bring in more dialect education into their classrooms. But as far as foreign language teaching, this seems to be almost completely ignored. And what I want to suggest is that I'm not saying we should be teaching using rural dialects, or that we should start producing teaching materials and textbooks that work with rural dialects, but some sparse inclusion, so paying attention to the way our students speak and how it differs from the standard idea of standard Japanese can do a couple of great things, I think. One is that it can increase our students' motivation to learn this language, because again, like I said, we're bringing it closer to the way that they normally express things, right? Where if we start associating English language with their more native dialects, they will start to see a stronger connection between things that they want to say and the English language. In addition, I think having a role model as a teacher occasionally show that, hey, it's okay to speak this dialect once in a while. I can be a productive member of society, I can be an educated person and use a dialectal form once in a while, can show the students that it's not a terrible thing, and that you can become a productive member of society, you can become an educated person even if you speak a certain dialect. So that's it for me, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, we might have a minute or two.
4 minutes.
4 minutes for questions. Anybody? Yes.
I'm sorry, I came a little bit late, so I only caught the second part of your presentation, I suppose. And as I was listening to you, there were quite a few things that crossed my mind. First of all, I used once, I think, Hiroshima Ben in my class.
Sure.
The students didn't understand it. Okay, so my question is like, are you talking about an elementary school situation, high school, or university? Because elementary school, yes, everybody is local, but university situation, probably not.
Sure.
So whose dialect should you be using?
Right. I'm talking more specifically about elementary level or junior high school, beginner levels like that, for sure. However, let's say if you're in a one-on-one situation with a student who you know is from a certain region, as a university teacher, you may still want to employ that. It can bring you closer to your students, I think. But it's definitely, you have to kind of identify, you want to be careful that you're speaking in a way that people understand you, obviously, right? If you're speaking in front of a class of, let's say, 30 to 100 students, and they're from all parts of the country, you don't want to necessarily bust this out. Yeah.
Thanks, Dan. Really interesting. The graph you put up, couldn't you help but notice it's quite old, from 1980, I think, was it?
Yes.
So, is this something that's more or less the same now? Has it gotten worse? Has it changed at all over the last 30 years, would you say? Or is it
Actually, it has changed. I don't have, do I have the graph here today? This is actually what my dissertation was. This is what I was studying this year. And it has changed a little bit. This particular dialect is still considered to be very unintelligent. The general shape of the graph hasn't changed. What has changed is some of the associations. For example, when you ask people about intelligence, it's not necessarily, when this was done, this original study was done, it was interpreted, the connections between the words were interpreted in such a way that not urban equals not modern equals unintelligent equals inarticulate, right? And when I replicated this experiment, what I found was that actually the intelligence marker was a bit higher, still on the low end, but a little bit better. And most importantly, the elements like how articulate the language sounded, or how refined or how intelligent the language sounded, were completely divorced from how distant it sounded from Toku dialects. So I thought that was cool, and I think part of the reason why I mentioned my last point was because some of what I found in my research was that bringing dialects into education at the earlier levels like this can, I gotta stop so I can't even finish that sentence, but it can slowly change the attitudes. Yeah. So thank you very much.